Well, I'm really excited about hearing about this guest tonight.
Hearing about him?
And talking with him.
Well,
and hearing him talk. I've checked him out on Instagram and stuff, and the guy apparently does everything. Spoken artist, visual artist, comic book creator, podcaster. He has IMDb writing credits, and he's got 6 or 7 of them. Truly amazing. This guy, Arthur Belfield, is going to be fascinating to talk to, and I'm so looking forward to it.
I can't even add anything to all that.
Well, you're going to have a big part of the discussion tonight because you're like a semi-retired, half-hidden comic nerd yourself, and so
I know a bit about comic books.
You know about comic books. He knows a lot about comic books.
He knows a lot more. Cause
Welcome to the third chair. I'm Peter. That's Doug, and we are here with our special guest, Arthur Belfield. Arthur, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Arthur.
As we mentioned in the introduction, you wear many hats.
I do.
You spoken word artist, visual artist, podcaster, comic book writer. So let's kick things off with your whole story, or at least part of it, of your comic book writing and creating. Tell us about that a little bit. How long you been doing that? How'd you get into that?
I blame Stan Lee, the late great Stan Lee. I was 12 years old. I met Stan Lee 4 times in my life.
No way.
Yeah, Stan the man. I was 12 years old. Went to a comic book convention. I had recently just got into comic books at the time, and there he was, in full Stan Lee. He's, charisma, all that,
Is that before everybody went to comic book conventions?
No, this was, I would say, the early 90s, probably about 91.
Oh, okay.
To give a time frame. So comic book conventions were a big thing, but it didn't really blow up until they attached the movie stars to them, and then some of them became
San
more...
Diego became so big.
Exactly. You're like, were the comic books at the comic book convention? That became a thing. But just seeing how excited Stan Lee was about something that I had, started reading, it really got me motivated. And so I was already writing little stories, but they weren't like superhero stories. And then I started doing little fan fiction. Everybody has their X-Men story, their Spider-Man story, their Batman story. And I didn't know this was a career that real people did. It didn't dawn on me until I met, Stan Lee, and it was some other creators. Ben Dunn, who does Ninja High School, was there. And later, fast forward 20, 30 years, I got to work with him, and I did a book called Tainted Love that was published by Antarctic Press, which is a company he started. Mm-hmm. But it was just meeting Stan Lee, seeing his enthusiasm that made me say, hey, I want to write a comic. So fast forward to 2006, I wrote my first comic. It was called Battle Eulogy, and hired an artist from the Philippines because it was cheap. I was broke. People still do that.
People still do that.
That's how independent comics are made.
Yeah, Fiverr, Upwork,
Disney had a Donald Duck series that premiered in the Philippines, and it was drawn by the Filipinos. And then the first time it was shown in the U.S. is when Disney Plus.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Did people enjoy it for what it was?
This was one of the best Donald Duck series I ever seen. It was fantastic.
Wow.
If you go on IMDb, it's got like an 8.8 rating, which is unusual for a cartoon.
That is, especially I'm thinking about when they made it, as opposed to when American audience got to see it, and it was still held up great. So that says a lot about the quality that they put in there.
Right.
And with comic books, first one, Battle Eulogy, I did 3 issues of it, and it was a learning process.
Sure.
I didn't know about pacing. I didn't know about developing a character, developing the antagonist, supporting characters. I was just like, can they just fight on every panel? And I had these long word balloons that took up half the page, and I learned. Because there were a few books like How to Make Comics the Marvel Way, Peter David, he wrote a book on how to make comics, Scott McDaniel. But all that wasn't available to me at the time in the early 90s. And then when I finally made my first book in 2006.
How old were you?
Oh, God. I'm 47 now, probably late 20s, I would say.
Yeah. Oh, wait,
Might be wrong on
I
that time, but late 20s. But it was an amazing experience, and it was a learning process. Now we're in 2023. All this information's on YouTube. You know, just a quick search: how to write a comic book, how to draw a comic book, how to publish a comic book. But for the early days, we had talked earlier about like how the independent comics start, and I know one of y'all was saying some guy claimed it started in the 80s, and you're like, no, it started back in the 40s. People were drawing it on notebook paper, stapling it together, passing around schools and colleges, you know, and
World War II comics were really big.
yeah, they were huge. War comics were huge. Romance comics. Marvel used to publish romance, you know.
I remember reading those like I was 14 years old, like romance, like because my cousins had comics laying around. I would grab one.
Oh, well.
Yeah. See, my first comic book I ever read was Conan the Barbarians, black and white, one of my uncle's comics, and you know, I was like, this is cool, you know. And comics were something because they weren't readily available. I didn't know where comic book shops were growing up, and you know, once I started going to conventions and things of that nature and learning that it's a real career, you know, it was like a light went off. I want to do this with my life. Wow. And luckily I've been able to do it and have some success. I've sold over 40,000 comic books, you know, which to me is a success. Some people are like,
yeah,
well,
sold 40,000 comic books?
Across all the different ones that I've written, they've sold around 40,000.
Well, you know, I'm so glad you came here tonight, Art, because I had no idea that my co-host was a comic book nerd in disguise.
My brother has close to or maybe over 10,000 comic books.
Nice.
Now, Peter's just a general nerd.
So
We haven't classified him yet?
I gleaned some stuff from him, and then I've read comic books that you know, different ones that I like and stuff like that. So I do know
about 10,000 comics.
Do you write and create the characters? Are you ever involved in illustration? Because I've seen some of your visual artwork, which is also very good. Do you do both, or how do you decide what parts of a project that is mainly your bellywig and what you sort of outsource?
When you create comic books on an independent level, you're in charge of the whole production line. And what happens is you submit it, when you're done, the completed comic, over to an Image Studios or IDW and see if they want to publish it. So initially I come up with an idea for a script, like Black Villains Wanted. I was like, why aren't there that many black villains? And I can only think of like 5 or 6 of them. It really took time to think of them. But I put a bunch of black villains into this comic book, and it was a hit. People gravitated towards it because it was one of those things where nobody thought about it. You know, so I was like, okay. So come up with your idea, then your story, and then you got to create characters to fill it. And since I have some artistic skills, I'll sketch out a drawing and I'll give it to a concept artist to flesh it out. And that concept artist may or may not be the same one that's going to actually draw the sequential pages. But it helps to have those visuals, the turnarounds, to give to an artist like, hey, this is how my character looks. Can you replicate this?
Sure.
And it has ups and downs. I tell people, don't get into comic books to make money. Lately, people have gone towards crowdfunding. And some people,
I saw that you did some campaigns, some Kickstarter and Indiegogo, I think. How did that go?
It went good. One project, what do you call it? Agent Solo. We did 3 campaigns with that character, and over $10,000.
Yes.
I ran one for Black Villains Wanted. It was over $2,000. Then I had a couple other comic book projects that my name was involved in that did more. So the money's out there. Eric July, who is a YouTuber, who not my favorite person in the world, but he did a comic book called Isom last year, over $3 million, one issue. And right now he's projected to make another $3 million with Isom 2. So the money's out there, but I look at him as a YouTuber, an influencer, I guess that's what we're calling people, who happen to make a comic book. So his fan base was already there. So it didn't matter what project he released, X amount of them were going to support it.
Nice. And I noticed preparing for the show that several of the projects you've done Black Villains Wanted, Agent Solo, Tainted Love, Wars Chosen. A lot of those are available on Amazon.
They're available on Amazon. Tainted Love's available through Anarch Press. And amazingly enough, and it made me feel proud, I don't know why, so a lot of these projects are on eBay. I'm like, people are already reselling my work. That's a compliment.
That is. Well, we'll talk more about the whole field of indie comics, which I find fascinating, when we come back from this break.
Okay.
Welcome back to the third chair. We have Arthur here. He's back. He didn't leave us after the first 10 minutes. And
Which is really amazing with us three.
and then we have
Or at
Peter.
least you two.
I am still here. Yo.
Another week. So,
Another week.
you work with independent comics. Can you tell our audience what an independent comic?
An independent comic book is any comic book written, drawn, published that's not published by Marvel and DC. However, that term is a little misleading because you have companies like Dark Horse. You have companies like Image Comics, who are big companies. But if it's not from Marvel or DC, everybody just lump everybody in together. So you got the middle range companies, you got the self-publishers. It's all called indie comics or independent comics.
Dark Horse has been around for a while.
They
hasn't it?
have.
Yeah. So,
And they've survived mostly on licensing deals from Star Wars, of course, Buffy the Vampire, and things of that nature. So it's interesting to see what they're doing post losing in the Star Wars license, what they're going to do. And they really haven't done much in the last few years.
oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I read that George Lucas, he liked independent, and he considered the Star Wars independent movies, and he said, so he went with Dark Horse Comics to print comic books for the Star Wars. Yeah.
Which is good, especially if you compare the quality of those stories versus when Marvel had the Star Wars license, I think in the 70s or 80s. Those stories were goofy, they were fun, but they weren't serious fiction the way the Dark Horse stories are.
So,
I know I said serious fiction in comic books.
No, I'm just
No,
thinking
there's
more comic book nerd talk right here live on the third
you
chair.
read most graphic novels. A lot of those are independent.
Yeah.
And that there's a lot of serious fiction in those. I mean,
I'm just thinking graphic novels, and I'm thinking The Walking Dead, which is one of the bigger independent comic book success stories. It spanned, 4 or 5 different spin-offs just based off the Walking Dead comic book. And once it was announced it was going to be a TV show, they collected it into graphic novels, different volumes. Then they put it in Barnes & Noble, and I've never seen anything like this. The Marvel movies, the DC movies, none of them have ever been able to translate into comic book sales to make those sales, increase. But The Walking Dead, that TV show, the individual issues of the comic book as well as the graphic novel volumes, huge sales increase.
oh, is that right? Wow.
Now, I'm curious. What's the difference between a really long comic book and a graphic novel? I mean, when do you transition from a long comic book to a graphic novel, or is it totally?
Peter has asked this question before.
I mean, it's basically the same. I mean, unless the comic book has like 12 different stories in it, and
But
anthology then.
like a graphic novel, like 75 pages plus, I assume, maybe a little bit shorter sometimes.
Sometimes some people look at anything over 50 pages. Some people anything over 100 pages. That's always been an argument, you know.
I think 50 pages does it.
Yeah. And then some graphic novels are just a complete story, and some of them they collect the single issues into one volume. And there's arguments both ways. I'm like, I got a long comic book to read. I'm happy. It's 100 and some pages, you know, which is often cheaper than buying the individual issues.
Sure.
Because nowadays it's $4.99, $5.99, $6.99 versus 75 cents an issue, $1 issue.
Well, when I was a kid, you could get a 100-page comic book for a quarter.
Wow.
Justice League, and there'd be like 3 or 4 stories. I mean, you spend a long time reading and looking at that.
This is when
comic book.
Moses was writing comics.
This was in the 60s.
I give you these 10
comic book commandments.
Yes.
But they used to have a comic code, oddly enough, that had those 10 commandments. Like you couldn't use certain words like terror. It was a whole bunch of different things you couldn't do. And now the comics code is pretty much forgotten about.
Oh, because they don't need it. They had to fight to keep comic books alive because somebody wrote a book that was called Seduction of the Innocent.
Mm-hmm.
And it said that we were badly influencing kids with comic books. And so
that's what I used to think that a graphic novel meant, is that there was a bunch of swearing and a bunch of scantily clad women.
Some of them there is.
Frank Miller,
Yeah.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the original independent comic book again, very violent. Wasn't the Saturday morning cartoon characters that you see. They just did a Ninja Turtle story called The Last Ronin, which was some of them were decapitated, limbs missing, very graphic.
Yeah.
One of the best ninja stories, well, one of the better comic book stories I've ever read.
Well, the redo of the movie was violent too.
Yeah.
The first one was happy and funny, and the second one was serious.
Sin City was nominated for Oscars. It might have won a couple.
Mm-hmm.
Graphic novel. There's one Johnny Depp starred in, a Jack the Ripper case, very dark, From Hell, graphic novel. I mean, they've taken graphic novels and made
them graphic.
Yeah.
And
not everything is superheroes, but a lot of people associate comic books with superheroes, like the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, comic book. Men in Black, comic book.
And they made a movie, both of those, yeah.
I mean, wasn't the original Batman somewhat darker than the Adam West series in the 19...
Well, way darker.
Bam!
Adam West series was probably as light as you could get. The original Batman had a machine gun in his airplane.
Nice,
yeah.
I know. So it was a lot different, and they toned him down before that series. But
well, remember Captain America was killing Nazis.
Yeah.
Wonder Woman was decapitating people. Like, the superheroes were not all friendly. Let's save everybody, not kill our villains. People forget that. Well, a lot of us went around, for that.
Well, you can read those written in the 40s or the 50s and see the influence of world wars that probably influenced people's thinking on it as well.
Oh, yeah, DC used to, and Marvel did the same too, but theirs was more in the 60s, but DC went back. They reprinted the original Superman. I got that.
Nice.
And the original Batman.
I mean,
that's how I knew he got machine gun.
Like, I read that.
Who did G.I. Joe? Because even some of those were kind of violent for the time.
That's Hasbro owns those.
But there was G.I. Joe comics. I remember reading them.
There was a comic section for kids that wasn't superheroes, like Casper the Friendly Ghost.
Archie. Wendy the Witch.
Yeah.
But even Archie, they got dark with that.
Yeah.
They did.
The TV show is. I haven't watched it, but it's dark.
Yep.
You know, this guy, he went to school with my brother. He was his roommate one year in college, and he was going back for his PhD in literature.
Mm-hmm.
And he says he loved the Archie comics because he can be somewhere and he can read the comic in 2 minutes, and it was so mindless, and it took him away from like
Everyday reality.
and everyday reality and the serious novels that he was reading to get through his PhD and stuff like that. It's like, okay, I'm going to rest the mind. I'm going to read an Archie comic. And
that was the whole thing, that escapism is why people fell in love with comic books, because this wasn't hyper realistic. It wasn't, oh, I'm dealing with, these problems at school or with my wife or husband and all that. It was like, hey, Batman's showing up. He's going to beat up some bad guys. He might get a little beat up himself, but at the end of the day, he's going to save the city. Or it was some super futuristic fantasy story where imagination, we talked about ElfQuest earlier. Mm-hmm. Like Wendy, Pina, and her husband, they created this world that was amazing. You wanted to go back to it. That's why Harry Potter, when that came out, it was such a big craze, because people were starving for imagination.
It was way better than Angry Birds.
And on that note, we're going to take a break. That was a good one, Peter.
When we come back, Art's going to do some poetry for us.
All right, okay. I can do that.
When we're right back. Real people, real stories, real life. We're looking for guests. We're looking for you here on the third chair. I'm Peter, that's Doug, and how many different ways can we have guests?
Oh, at least 3. We could have them here in the studio in Colorado Springs. We've had guests all the way from LA on Zoom, and we have gone on location, and we got our 3rd one already in the planning phase.
Awesome. Send us an email and we'll get you on the show.
Alright, this piece is called Protest. I wrote this in a time when the world was very confused. So I hope you like it. They don't understand the witchcraft of words, so they sit on the sidelines, ignorant of their own magic and mischief, praying for a God who may never return. They're praying for a God who may never return, praying for a God who may never come. So they ignore the child rebel soldiers. They ignore the unrest in Africa. Before and after it was colonized and gutted for its people and potions. And let's not forget its history. They ignore the Ukraine as if Russia hasn't started an inferno. 5 years from now, people will ask you, where were you when World War III began? These are the thoughts and predictions of a 5-year-old who wondered why his parents ignored the bombs and guns and bombs as if it were all a reality show. It wasn't real to them. Kim Kardashian is a distraction. As the world explodes into 1,000,001 pieces as if it were a weather balloon. Made in China, like half the shit you're wearing that you purchased at Walmart. But who's the real target? And to think it all started with words birthed within the cursed corners of creation. You see, I tried to commit suicide at age 19. I tried to talk to God. I tried to commit suicide at age 19 just so I could talk with God. Because I wanted answers. I wanted to end the calamity. I couldn't understand the world's insanity. So I cut myself again at age 23. And I cut myself again at age 30. And I cut myself and I cut myself. As if my death would somehow free the world, or at least let me escape from Colorado. So I just sat there like the unmoved maker, bleeding in and out of consciousness, ready to die without a reasonable doubt, because this conversation with God wasn't happening. God refused to talk to me, sent the shotgun to the head. And like magic, everything faded to black. There were no more guns and bombs over Baghdad. No more children being dragged into the streets of the abyss. No more false prophets and role models who secretly invaded the private parts of little girls. Everything faded to black. There were no more peace signs and happy face stickers on backpacks. No more words of wisdom handed out at barbershops to guide me into the light. You see, I died twice that night. I was flatlined, only to wake up in a hospital room void of the id, ego, and superego. Next to me was a child who smiled at me and said, God offers his apologies. He was a little too busy curing my cancer. He offers his apologies because the revolution of thought, the next age of enlightenment, can't happen without me. It can't happen without beautiful souls like me. Some of y'all may not understand the witchcraft of words, but understand this. Your God doesn't have to return and converse with you in the middle of the night for you to be inspired, not by war, but by the beautiful struggle and peace that beautiful souls can bring to the world. So smile for me. Smile for me. Light a candle and resurrect the world with me. I'm not dead yet, you see. Despite trying. Despite physically and spiritually trying, I'm not dead yet. Because it's not over yet. Not for you nor me. And there aren't enough bombs and guns in the world that can stop my protests, nor my poetry. Thank you.
Welcome to the third chair, and I'm going to ask a question I have no idea of the answer, Arthur, because Peter wrote this question, and I had no idea, and I said, I'm not going to look it up, I'm just going to ask it on the show.
Does it say I dare you to ask that question next to it?
That was implied.
It might be a boring answer, I don't know. What is bootlegging indie comic books?
I don't even know. No, I know.
I saw you talked about it on one of your Critical Nerd podcasts.
No, basically what that is, it goes back to the days of Napster, where people were using Kazam and LimeWire and all these different sites to steal movies, TV shows, things of that nature. They were also stealing books and comic books. So people would have 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 comic books on their hard drive. And they haven't stopped doing it. So there's still sites where you can go and it's like, oh, I don't support Marvel or DC. I'm not giving them my money, but I still want to read their story so I can complain about it. So they will go to these pirate sites. But that's what people do.
I know.
I'm not going to buy it, but I'm going to steal it because I'm kind of interested.
Let me give y'all a little backstory. The independent comic book scene right now is divided between two camps. One camp is called Comicsgate, and they're like, we don't like all of these progressive changes they're making in comic books. They're ruining the characters. They're gender swapping characters. They're race swapping characters. So that's one group. They want things to go back to the way they were, I guess, in the 50s, 60s, and so forth. The other group is like, we need more diversity, more inclusion, more gay characters, more women characters to the forefront. So that's where, for the last 4 years, the independent comic book scene has been. So you have podcasters, you have creators, all bickering over comic books. Grown men with full beards complaining about comic books.
But they each can write their own, right?
Yeah, but they want to complain about what Marvel and DC are doing.
Oh.
Yeah, I'll talk about the...
But that's a limited... Are they still doing as well? I mean, besides the movies, are their comic books still selling as well?
They're still selling. Despite all these people complaining and saying, they're not selling. I'm like, well, that one just sold 50,000 issues.
And besides the selling, they got the stealing, too.
Yeah.
I don't know if that counts in the figures.
That's what these people that are complaining, they're not even buying it. You're complaining about something that you are not buying. How does that help anybody? Because even if you don't support Marvel or DC, they have to hire writers, artists, colorists. And if that book isn't selling, it's because you told your fan base, don't buy this book. This book is bad. So that writer, artist, or whoever that got hired to write that book, it may have been an ongoing series. Now, issues 1 and 2 didn't sell because you had all these YouTubers painting this narrative, this is a bad book, and some people don't use their own minds. They're like, well, so-and-so on the internet said it's bad, I'm not going to buy it. And that might have been their
true if the internet says Twitter would never lie.
No.
Well, when I was thinking about that question, I was also thinking about our independent creators stealing each other's work to claim as their own. Was that part of the bootlegging problem? Or is that a separate one?
That's been a comic book problem. You see, and when I read, like DC would sometimes develop like a team of 4 guys in a Jeep in a war.
Yep.
6 months later, all of a sudden there's a Marvel one. And I mean, it went both ways, but you see that a lot.
You do, and that goes back to Challengers of the Unknown by DC, which is essentially the Fantastic Four. You had a lot of instances where Jack Kirby, you know, he worked for Marvel, they fired him, went over to DC, so he had a lot of similar characters. It's like which one was created first. So you had that, but to answer the question as far as the independent comics, a lot of these creators don't trademark and copyright their characters. And so they were like, oh, well, I have this comic book character. They see your version. Oh, you're stealing up from me. But I've never seen your comic book character. It's just a lot of people aren't creative with the designs. That's why, going back to the Marvel and DC, with Captain Marvel, that name. DC had their version. Marvel had theirs. They went back and forth in court. So DC could call Captain Marvel Shazam in the book, but they couldn't put Captain Marvel. They can call Shazam Captain Marvel in the book. They just couldn't put Captain Marvel on the cover.
And you know, the original Captain Marvel was Fawcett, and DC sued Fawcett because he was too close for Superman, and they won.
And then they bought it.
Yeah, because Fawcett was going broke anyway because comic books were dying in the late 50s. So it's a rural.
You're both comic book nerds.
Well, we might.
That's the highest level of compliments.
Well, I grew up in an age where if you read a comic book in school, you had to hide it inside of your textbook. You know, being a nerd, you have to do that undercover. Now it's like the popular thing to be.
Yeah, I
know.
I remember I bought most of my comic books on summer vacations.
Yeah. When
school was out, and you'd go camping, and you'd read them in your tent with your flashlight or whatever.
And those days, you could comic books anywhere. You go to a convenience store.
Eckerd.
There'd be a whole Eckerd. The PX. My parents, because we had to drive like 30 miles to get to the commissary, and then you go to PX, and they said, if you're good, we'll get you each a comic book, my brother and I.
Oh, nice.
Well, and I never knew that that comic books expired. I remember as a kid buying them, and they would clip the corner, and instead of being 25 cents, they were now selling them for 10 cents.
Oh, wow.
And I wasn't sure if that was because if they didn't sold, they had a deal where they had to be returned, or but if
Yeah,
they
it was
were a little
part
bit
of it.
damaged,
Yeah.
they couldn't be returned, and so now
But this is really nerdy. They had to be returned if they didn't sell, and then that's how many comic books you got the next time was based on how many you
Yeah.
sold.
But
So-
if they were partly damaged, they couldn't return them, and
Right.
so then they were selling them.
Right.
Yeah, the things.
The newsstand market, I'm sorry that it's not there because it opened the door. If you go to, Eckerd, I miss Eckerd. You go to CVS or wherever and you see that stand and you're like, hey, kids would beg their parents to buy it. But now,
Oh yeah.
if you're not ordering online, you have to find a comic book store, and a lot of people have zero clue where a comic book store, unless they happen to be into comic books or trading cards or something like
Yeah.
that.
So if I ordered one of your books online from Amazon, am I going to get a PDF digital download, or are they going to ship me a hard copy?
I think.
It depends if you buy the digital or if you buy the hard copy.
So they're both available.
Yeah.
How does your comic book look on digital? Have you looked at it on digital? Does it look as good?
Amazon bought Comixology, which was a site that both Marvel, DC, a lot of independent creators as well used, and they would have, you can read it just like scroll up the page, or it had enhanced viewing where it'll bring up each panel individually and you can read. But the Kindle version is just, page one, you scroll up page two, and so forth.
Okay. So
Nice.
it works pretty well then. Okay.
But this is the weird part. Marvel, DC, nobody releases their digital numbers. So nobody knows how well these digital comics are selling. When they first came out with digital comics, people were like, oh, that's going to kill print comics. It hasn't. It's just, they still won't give us this digit. It's kind of like Netflix and the streaming services won't tell you how many people are actually viewing these shows and movies. That's part of the whole writer's strike, thing, because they're like, we need to get paid for these streaming numbers.
I'm old school. I like to buy hard copies of books. I like to mark them up. I mean, I
think
know it's
comic
way
books
easier.
Comic books, because I like to go on a page if it's well done. You can see the flow.
Nice.
Yeah, well done.
And there's some of those comics out there, Amazing Fantasies, a certain number with a guy who walked on walls. You have one of those, you got money.
Oh yeah, the resale value on certain, they call them key issues, is amazing. And now they have comic books, kind of like trading cards, where you can get your comic books graded. It's like, oh, this is a 6.8 versus a 9.0.
Oh, wow.
That 9.0 is going to be
just
worth
like a
more.
rare coin.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, my brother's done that.
And I imagine some are autographed.
Yep. And that's why a lot of people go to conventions. They're like, oh, Jim Lee, he's going to be there. Who drew X-Men, Wildcats for his own company.
Comic books and books this bit thick my brother had.
Nice.
We're going to go to our last segment. The time has flown. But I think it was listening to your beautiful poetry and your recitation in the third segment. So now we're going to go to our last segment.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Peter from Pikes Peak Recovery Coaching, and as you know, I do help people with drug and alcohol recovery issues. I love to help people get better, but I also offer a variety of other services, including regular life coaching services. I've helped several people write and finish a book. I've helped a doctor that was in medical school graduate and then get into a residency. And I also actually have quite a background in mathematics, and I do some math tutoring for the GED as well as the ASVAB for those that are thinking about a career in the military. So my contact information is on the screen. Please send me an email or a text, and we can talk about some of these services and how I can help. That's Peter Grigg at Pikes Peak Recovery Coaching. Welcome back to the third chair. I'm Peter. That is comic book nerd Doug over there, and our wonderful guest Arthur Billfield.
Did you call him a comic bird?
Yeah, comic bird.
Tells jokes.
Yeah, comic book nerd. I did not know till tonight just how much he loved this more than baseball, and that's saying a lot.
Well, he's like a comic book historian.
He is. You know, he was an auditor for the Defense Department. He was used to like chewing out 3-star generals.
I could tell you that there is a famous comic book writer and artist who started in World War II a comic book on maintenance. And there's a famous comic book award, the Eisner Award, is named after this guy, Will Eisner, who
Made
did
a
comic books for the Army.
like
Nice.
how-to training manuals, kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Uh-huh.
Oh, wow.
Jack Kirby did too.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that about Jack Kirby.
You know, you'll always find a piece of useful information watching our show.
Well, it was useful, but it
It'll
was
come in
different.
handy in bar trivia one day.
So I was talking with Art during the break, and I said, here's a question. If you could get a message out to the world, an important message to you, through the medium of comic books, what would that message be?
It's a hard question.
I know
Very
there's,
hard.
Lots of angles.
But I'm ready for it.
All right, go for it.
For over 75 years, when people think of hope, they see this S symbol. Superman. That S stands for hope in Kryptonian. So if I can get any message out, it would be no matter what your mental, physical, financial, social status is, there's always hope for a better tomorrow. I'm a creativity coach, so I help creators get unstuck when it comes to writer's block or creative blocks of any kind. And in life, we get stuck. Why ain't my marriage going the way I want it? Why ain't I getting promoted? Why am I still ugly? Why am I still fat?
That's been me all my life.
Yeah.
Why am I so ugly?
And we know, it's like, oh, we can get plastic surgery like the Kardashians, or we can go to that gym that we pay $10 a month, but we don't want to do any of that. Sometimes you just feel stuck in life. And for whatever reason. And we all got our reasons why we get stuck on certain things. And you have to have hope, because without hope, you're never going to trigger yourself to learn that sometimes you got to pivot and do something else. Or sometimes you just got to take a seat back and look at what you've done so far to get you where you are. And then it'll be revealed to you where you need to go next. Or sometimes it's, you know what? All my friends are toxic. I'm never going to become a doctor or a lawyer hanging around these guys. They all work at 7-Eleven. So sometimes just changing your friend group, your circumstances, letting go of toxic relationships will help you unlock that hope. And I'm using the word hope loosely because I'm just looking at it as change.
Sure.
That's what hope is. It's how am I going to change my finances, my life, my mentality, my circumstances, job, whatever the case may be. You have to have that hope that you can change it, because if you don't, you're like, oh, everybody around me is just chilling, doing nothing, I might as well. And you let your outside influences influence you, even though people never said don't do this. It's just you looked around and nobody else was trying to achieve anything, so you lost hope.
Okay, that's a good answer, a hopeful answer.
Hopefully things will change for them.
So you're all over social media. I follow you on Instagram, and I know you got links to your other social media stuff you're doing. If someone wanted to get a hold of you, I guess what would be some reasons that someone would get a hold of you? Like, do you do commission cartoons? Do you do commission comic books? What kinds of things would you invite the public to contact you for?
That's a scary question. Most people generally get and contact me for two reasons. One, I founded the Colorado Springs Poetry Slam, so a lot of people contact me regarding speaking engagements around classes or, hey, when's the next Poetry Slam? Another component, I have a YouTube channel called Critical Nerd Theory, where I talk about comic books. I talk about pop culture, things that are important to nerds and nerd culture. So they can find me at Critical Nerd Theory on YouTube. They can find me if they're interested in the poetry stuff, either at the Colorado Springs Poetry Slam website, or they can find me at Arthur Wright Stuff on Instagram.
All right, and we'll put that contact information on the screen for people. Well, thank you for a riveting discussion. I never knew there was so much to comics, but there's so much more to you, and so you've agreed to come back next week, and we're still going to talk about your skills as a visual artist, a podcaster, a spoken word artist. We got lots more ground to cover, and we're delighted to do it.
Okay, I'm here for it.
All right. So until then, please like, subscribe, share, and hit the bell notification icon so you know when we've uploaded another episode. Good night from all of us at the Third Chair.